this time. And in John chapter 9, we just come back out of John chapter 8, and we realize that Jesus had just passed through a crowd to where he had identified himself as being the Son of God and being the Messiah. And the religious people were so upset, angry, and they wanted to stone him. They tried to stone him. It says that he just went ahead and just avoided it and passed through the midst of them. We don't know how he did it. We don't know whether he was running, ducking, hiding, jumping. We don't know how he did it. But he obviously did it, and he passed on. Well, that was on the day before the Sabbath day. The next day, as we come to chapter 9 in John, it says, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And it's amazing to me the compassion of Jesus as he was so aware of every single person around him. He walks by, and he might have seen this man before. We don't know whether he did or didn't, but we know that this man was, many people knew of this man. They all walked by, they'd seen him, they were acquainted with him, being in his neighborhood. All of those things, they knew all about this guy. And he was there in a certain place, and he was begging for alms, which is what they had to do in those days in order to get some food on the table, to be able to live, to be able to have something happen. But Jesus is always amazing to me because he always saw the multitudes. And then he saw in the multitudes, he saw the individuals within the multitudes, and he was always moved with compassion. His heart was to touch lives. His heart was to meet needs. His heart was to do what he was sent to do. And so this is exactly what he was doing. And his disciples were also right there along with him. And they observed the man also. And they asked Jesus, they said, Rabbi, who sinned, verse 2, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You know, some of the thoughts of that day, some of them have the Greek philosophy, that somehow you lived in a different life in a former life, and if you weren't what you should have been in that former life, then you got into this life, and you were punished. Well, we recognize that was certainly not a godly philosophy. And another philosophy they had was that if you had a chance in this life to live the way you should, but God already knew how you were going to live in this life, and he knew if you were going to be an ungodly person or not. So if you were, then he would punish you with blindness or whatever it might happen to be. Well, we know that God doesn't operate in that way. That is not according to the character of God at all. But these disciples were under that philosophy. They had heard it. I don't know if they believed in it. I hope they didn't believe in it. But they obviously were influenced strongly by that kind of a philosophy that the issues of imperfections within a human life, within a physical body, were the result of sin in that life. And so they said, who in the world sinned then, Jesus, that this man was born blind? Was it his parents or was it him that sinned? And so Jesus answered and said this, in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. So we recognize that Jesus knew that even as he passed by that man, observing that man, knowing what he was needing to do in that man's life, that it was the will of God that he would touch that man and heal and open the eyes of the blind person. He had a focus that was purposeful in that life. Well, I want to encourage us to recognize that we live in a community, we live in a world that is full of sin. And we recognize that even as it started out in perfection, as Jesus and God, as they made the earth, they created it, they created man, they created all the things in it, but we recognize that he had given authority to man on the earth. I want us to turn over to Genesis 1. Genesis 1. And in the verses of 26, starting with verse 26, God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, And you're talking about a triune God here, by the way. Let us, our likeness, let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill and subdue the earth, have dominion over the fish, over the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then we recognize that God gave man tremendous responsibility. Turn over to Genesis 2, 15 to 17. And the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend it and to keep it. He was responsible for it. But he also gave a limitation to them, and they were to obey that. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may eat freely of, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat it, you shall surely die. And so we recognize then as the enemy came in, Satan came in, tempted Eve, that Eve gave in to that, to the focus and sinned, knowing that she shouldn't be doing that. Adam then went into agreement with her, didn't want to lose her. We don't know all the reasons why he did what he did, but he purposely, with his eyes wide open, she was deceived, he was not deceived. He knew what he was doing when he went in and did what he did. But in the process of that, they gave the dominion that they had been given over the earth, they gave it to Satan and to Satan's realm. Now, turn over to Luke 4. In Luke 4, we find out that just after Jesus was baptized, that he was led by the Spirit of God into the wilderness and was tempted of the devil. And so in that Luke 4, 5 through 7, it says, the devil, taking him up on a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, all this authority I will give you and their glory, for this has been delivered to me. And it happened in the Garden of Eden when man sinned. I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all will be yours. And of course, we know the response of Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. It's written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. We recognize that reality. And so, but Jesus was offering, or Satan was offering to Jesus the ability to shortcut his focus upon this earth, to come and to die for sinful man, and to buy man back into a position of redemption. He says, hey, you can just shortcut it. You can just come and bow down before me, and I'll give you back the kingdoms that were given to me because of the sin of Adam and Eve. So, and then we realize that also then, as Jesus was crucified, that the power of that power of sin over all of those things was broken. Turn over to Colossians 2 and verse 15. Colossians 2, verse 15. In fact, I want to go back to 14. And then let's go back to 13. And you being dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven all of your trespasses, having wiped out just means erased the whole thing, the handwriting of requirements, which was the law, that was against us, and it was against us because perfection was demanded. No man could ever keep that. It was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having fulfilled the law, and having nailed it to the cross. He died in our place, suffering our penalty for it. And then in the process of that, it says, having disarmed principalities and powers, Satan's demonic powers, all of Satan's authority. He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. Now what we recognize is that the power that Satan had, responsible for sin, man's sin, responsible to destroy basically this nation and all the things that were the product of man's rebellion, which was the sin of man, producing all of these terrible effects upon this earth. That authority of Satan was curbed, and it was curbed in the life of the believer. So what we see is God had a position of authority that was his. He gave it to man, and man gave it to Satan. and God defeated Satan at the cross, and we haven't seen the final edict yet, when the finality comes in the sentencing of Satan and all of his demonic host forever into hell. But we recognize that the focus and the purposes of Satan were curbed and especially in the life of the believer. But what we realize is we are living in a sinful world. Sin has its devastating effects upon all of us. We all see it. We have seen the tragic suffering, the heartache, the calamity, the things that come into this world. We see all of these things, and we say, well, what in the world produced all this stuff? Well, it was sin. The sin of mankind brought all of these things. In fact, it brought our termination of life. All of these things, old age, would never experience any of these things had not Adam and Eve, Adam sinned and sold it over to Satan, to where Satan, his purposes, remember, are to kill, to steal, and to destroy. He has not got any good focus for anybody, even in his own kingdom. It's not a good focus. So behind all that suffering, calamity, everything that we look at, it is the product of sin. We need to recognize the reality of that. And so we understand then, if man would have been faithful to God, would have been obedient to God, would have obeyed God, we would never have the things that we have in this world. It would have been a perfect world. It was created perfectly, in perfection. Man was given the authority to rule over that, and yet he, in rebellion, chose to go the wrong direction, and we reap the consequences of that thing. So in an ideal world, in the kingdom age, in the time when God sets up his kingdom and rule after the millennial reign of Christ, which will be a radical change in the 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth. But after that, when the new heavens and the new earth come, it's perfection every way. There's no sin. There's nobody going to be able to be. Nobody has that nature. It's going to be perfected in every single way. So we recognize that focus. But we would have to recognize the truth and the reality of living in this world. We are still seeing and will continue to see the effects of sin until Jesus comes and reigns and rules in his kingdom. Often a person suffers. And again, we realize we have to recognize the reality that we're suffering because of sin. That is just where it is. We're getting old. We're all going to die if we don't get raptured because of sin. But God has given us the opportunity to believe in him and see all of those things not having the permanent, eternal effect upon us in this life. We'll have an eternal life instead of a life without Christ. So suffering is something that will happen, and it does happen to all of us. All of us have suffered. All of us will suffer because we live in a fallen world. But we also recognize that as we live in this fallen world, we have Jesus that comes with us. He's with us. He abides with us. He often delivers us, and if he doesn't deliver us, he'll go through the issues with us and deliver us in a different way. But he uses many times the circumstances of our life that are the result of sin to bring glory to his name. And I was just thinking about Fanny Crosby, and most of us know the story of Fanny Crosby. I want to just look at this real quick, but if I can find it. I'm not sure where it is. Anyway, Fanny Crosby, at 6 weeks old, got an eye infection, and obviously they called their doctor. The doctor was not able to be there, so another guy was sent, and he came and he put hot poultices upon her eyes and caused her to go blind. And so when the community found out that she had been blinded, this guy fled, and nobody ever heard of him again. Nobody knows what happened to him, or where he went, or what happened. He fled. And so then we know that her grandmother is the one that became the person, became her eyes for her. And she described the sunset, she described the birds, and all the beauty of creation, and all kinds of stuff. She just became the eyes for Fanny Crosby. At the age of, I believe it was 9, then another lady came in, and she began to teach Fanny and teach her the things that she needed to know, a lot of poetry, but a lot of the Bible. And Fanny had memorized, by the age of 10, she had memorized whole books of the Bible. In fact, she knew the majority of the Bible by heart. She had an incredible thing. She went to a school for school for the blind, to where she worked for a number of years after she finished her training there. But she never was good at the, what do you call it?
Braille. Braille.
Braille. She never was good at Braille. But she had an incredible mind. And so her mind just did all kinds of things with her. And then, of course, she got married. There's a lot of things that happened there with her life. But she became a very good at writing hundreds and hundreds of songs. A lot of the songs we sing today, many of them, Rescue the Perishing, Blessed Assurance, all kinds of them. We sing the songs that she sang. When she was very well known, she went to many of the presidents. They invited her to come in. And I mean, she was just so well known and well known with famous people. But the one thing that she did, she continued to, every opportunity she had, she continued to minister the gospel, to witness to people, to tell them who the Lord was, what the Lord had done in her life. And she came to the Lord at a revival service to where she went forward twice, and she never received the joy of the Lord. She never received a salvation experience. But the last time she came, she went to the altar on her own, and she just went down before the Lord and just crying out because she knew she hadn't received the Lord into her life. And so they sang a certain song, and I can't remember what it was, but anyway, as they sang that song, she just yelled out in the middle of the whole altar service. She says, "Hallelujah!" And so she was excited because she said, she was changed. She received God from that point on, and it was just from that point on. She was in love with Jesus all the way through. Somebody said, a preacher said, "Isn't it terrible that you had to go through this terrible thing of being blind all your life?" And she says, "No, if I had to do it over again, I would choose to go blind, because I know that when I go into heaven, the first one I'm going to see when my eyes are opened is Him." So we see the purposes. You know, God has purposes. Sometimes we go through tough stuff in our life. Sometimes healing does take place that God does, and sometimes it doesn't take place. And it doesn't mean our faith is lacking at all. It means that God does know what He wants for us to accomplish. Johnny Erickson, a good example, another one. Brian Sakatawatan, that was burned. All of these, we could just give many, many examples of how God used circumstances that were so negative that we'd never want to happen in our life, and the circumstances always coming in basically because of sin in this world. And so here she was. She was just absolutely used by God. And what I want us to grab a hold of, we see limitations within our life many times, and a lot of these limitations are because of sin. Not in our own lives, maybe not in the lives of somebody else, but sin has produced serious consequences within the life of the world. And so, but the limitations in our lives aren't limitations to God. And that's what we need to understand. We like to cry out for healing, which we need to be doing. If God chooses not to do that within our lives, we don't want to blame each other for lack of faith. There are a lot of other things that can take place, because that is a condemning message. But we want to lift people up. We want to lift them to God, and God will use them, just like He used Fanny Crosby, just like He used Johnny Erickson, just like He uses you and me as we go through situations within our life. God takes the evil sometimes, and He turns it for good. He brings beauty out of the ashes. There's so many times when things take place that are different than what we think. And this blind man, God had a purpose and a plan. God knew, God saw him, God understood what His purpose was in this life. And so He does a work within this man that's going to affect everything about him. And it's interesting to me because we have Ephesians 2, 8 to 10. It just says, "For by grace we're saved. That's not of ourselves. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest any man can boast about how they earned their salvation or whatever." But he says, "For we were created unto good works, that we would be able to walk in the path that He has already laid out for us to walk in." He has the path. And I tell you, that ought to encourage us, because we often all of us go through circumstances we don't want to go through. All of us go through situations where we see people hurting, and we want to meet the need. Sometimes we can't help the need. Other times we can. We see things happening. And so God's heart is always for us. It's never against us. And He has a path laid out for us to where we can rejoice in who He is in the middle of everything, whether it's good or bad from our perspective. So it's a blessing. And so in verse number 4, Jesus then goes a little bit further than just focusing upon the blindness of this man. And He lays it out. He brings it into an application of who He is and what His work is to accomplish here in this life. And this is what He says, I must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. Now what was He referring to? He's referring to the fact that He knew that He had a very short, limited time in order to minister to people. And this was at the very beginning of His Galilean ministry, so He had about 3 years. And He knew that crucifixion, when the night would come, the crucifixion would end that ministry as far as His fulfilling the works that God has sent Him to do. And so the first thing we recognize is then that God sent Jesus into this world. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever would put their faith in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life. I mean, that's forever. Life is radically changed because it's not a temporary existence, it's an eternal existence, obviously. And so He came, He knew why He was sent. He was sent by God, and He was sent to do the works of God. So what do we say, what are the works of God? Turn over to Luke 4. And Luke 4, starting with verse 16 to 21. And this, by the way, this is after he was baptized. He goes back to his city of Nazareth where he was raised, and he begins his Galilean ministry. And so when he came to Nazareth, verse 16, where he had been brought up, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, or to the humble. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, those that are crushed, those that are shattered, those that are smashed, those that are ground down. To proclaim liberty or freedom or release to the captives, those that are bound in sin. And recovery of sight to the blind, opening the eyes of the blind, spiritually and physically. And to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Or to, again, just bring freedom and release to those that are downtrodden, abused, and forsaken. And so, then he said, and then to proclaim deliverance or the acceptable year of the Lord. So we see the ministry of Jesus. It was just an incredible ministry. And what he said after that, he says in verse 21, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Well, it wasn't completely fulfilled. It was started. And it was going to be the beginning of what His purpose was as He was doing the works of His Father. And so we see that interesting limitation of time. He knew that it was critical that He fulfilled His purpose while He had the time. Is that any different with us? Is it any different that we have a limitation of time? None of us know. Tomorrow we could be taken out. Tomorrow the rapture could come. Today, we don't know how much time we have. And that's why we need to be busy about the work that God has given us to do. And so while it is day, while we have life that has been given to us. And so we see the works of Jesus being so profound in our own lives. And here we are, and it's interesting because Jesus is saying that I am, this is what He says in verse 5, I am, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And so, as the light of the world, He's displaying the works of Jesus. He's displaying the reality of who God is in perfection. And so they can look at Jesus and they can understand who God was in every way. And it's amazing to me because even as He says, I'm the light of the world, then He tells us, even as He's speaking to the multitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, He says, you are the light of the world. And He says, city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do men put a light under a bushel or under some kind of a basket, But they said they put it on a candlestick, on a lampstand, so that it gives light to all that are in the house. And he says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And that's what Jesus was doing. He was doing the good works of his Father. And he says, I've given you the ministry to do the good works of my Father too. And so we're the light, we're the salt, we're the people that have a powerful influence within the life of the community that we live in, the area that we live in, the world that we live in. And so then, when he's finished kind of revealing the reality of who he is to his disciples in answer to their question of who sinned, was it the parents, was it the guy? No, he said, no, none of that happened. But then he said these things. After he had said this, and after he had given these explanations, then he did what he was supposed to do. He knew it. And verse 6, he said he spat on the ground, and he made clay of the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. And then he said to this man, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Wow. You know, sometimes we think, well, the methods of Christ are the things that we need to follow. Well, to an extent, yes, that's true. But how many times did Jesus heal by spitting and making saliva in the mud and then putting that on the people's eyes? One time we know of. Other times he just spoke the word. Other times he touched the eyes. And we can't focus in on the methods. We need to focus in on the result of what obedience does when we're serving the Lord. Obedience produces results. And so here he is. He does what he does. And he's not creating a pattern for us to follow. Wouldn't it be interesting if all of us said, that's the pattern to follow? So all of us go out today and we go out and we learn how to spit. So we see how much we can spit. You know, what a mess. And then we, practice, stirring it up into mud or into clay. We don't do that kind of foolishness. Now, if the Lord required that of us, and that was the focus that we needed to do, then it would be revealed to us. That is the focus that we need to do. But we don't go after patterns and then think that that's the only way that we ought to do it. Jesus did many patterns, many things. And we need to look at the heart. The heart was a heart of compassion. The heart was to fulfill the will of his Father. And he knew what he needed to do in this particular situation. In every situation, he knew. We also become aware of what God wants us to do when we are in a situation where we need to meet a need. And I've never heard of anybody doing this. Maybe they have. I don't know. But we do know that God does have a desire for us to follow him. And when people don't follow the pattern that we may have established in our own thinking, as if this is the way of the Lord, then we have a tendency to criticize them because they don't follow the way we think they ought to do it. They don't do it the way we should do it. Or we think that God would want them to do it or whatever. And we become so blinded. It's like we swallow a gnat, or we strain at a gnat, a little tiny thing that wants to come into our mouth, and maybe when we're running or walking or whatever, we strain at that gnat, cough, cough, and we swallow the camera. We miss the focus of God's heart. We try to live by the letter of the law from our interpretation, and then we forget about the spirit of the law. What should have been taking place is that people should have been rejoicing at what God did in the healing of this blind man. And that is exactly what he designed for us to do. So we come back then to the blind man, and he goes and washes, he's clean, and then we realize that the neighbors observe him. And so the neighbors in verse 8 knew that he was blind. He says, is this not he who sat and begged? And some said, yeah, this is him. And others says, well, he sure looks a lot like him, but must not be the same guy. If you were blind and you were staggering around trying to find your way and having to be led, then all of a sudden your eyes were open, it may make a difference in your appearance. And you might look, wow, does that guy look the same? It's kind of like when we were young. People see us when we're young. 50 years later, we go to our high school or college reunion, and we realize I don't hardly recognize anybody. But as we get to know them, we begin to see the old patterns coming back in. We can, again, become familiar with them. They're still the same person. So this guy, who knows? But people said, I don't know if he's the same guy or not. But when he gets the focus, he says, I am he. I'm that guy. And he knew it. He knew it real well. And therefore they said to him, then how are your eyes open? And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. And so they said to him, where is he? And he said, I don't know. See, he hadn't even seen, he hadn't and did not have an ability to see Jesus. And he didn't even know what he looked like. And of course he didn't know where he was. So Jesus left, like he did all the time after a lot of his healings. He just left and got out of there and let what happened happen. So what did they do? Well, they brought him to the Pharisees, the religious leaders, so that they could maybe find out what in the world happened to this guy. And so it was the Sabbath, and here's the problem. They brought him to the Pharisees, verse 14, it was the Sabbath, it was when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. There's the problem. And so then the Pharisees also asked him again, says, how did you receive your sight? And he said to them, he put clay in my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And then some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he did not keep the Sabbath. Wow. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a great division among them. Isn't that amazing? They see an absolute miracle. They see a man that was blind from birth, now totally opened up. His eyes are open, they're perfect, they're back in 2020. And everything is looking perfect, and they're looking at this guy and said, well, who healed you? And he said, a man called Jesus. I don't know who he was. I haven't met him yet. And they said, well, this man obviously is an evil man because he did what he did on the Sabbath day and broke the law. Well, to be honest with you, he really hadn't broken a law. And we'll see that in just a minute here, if he was a prophet. And so they said, well, he broke the law. He went and spit and worked to stir up mud, and then he put it on the guy's eyes. That was the violation. And so they said, well, a sinner, he must be a sinner because there was no way that can happen. Others said, hey, how can a good man that did this, or a man being a sinner that did what he just did? And so there's great division. And so they called the blind man again. And so then they said, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? And he said this, he is a prophet. Now that was something that caused them and put them into a tremendous dilemma, because they believed that a prophet actually could be a person that could violate the law from their law perspective, because he was a godly man, a prophet, godly man, and he could actually violate that law, righteously violate that law, and so he was okay. The problem with that was that if they said that he was a prophet, then they would have to follow him and believe in him. And if they said he was not a prophet, then they had to come up with an explanation of how did this happen. And so trying to come up with that kind of a focus was a very difficult thing, and put them in a tremendous dilemma, because they either would have to acknowledge the miracle, or they would have to say it came from a satanic origin. And that's what they were trying. Backed out of the whole thing because of their fear of man, their fear of being excommunicated. So then, verse 24, it says, so they again called the man who was blind. So now they're still stuck in a dilemma. They call the guy back in, and they try to put the pressure on him by putting him, in a sense, under an oath, by saying, give glory to God. We know, and this is the pressure they put upon him, give glory to God, tell the truth, we know this man is a sinner. Wow, pressure. You know, how many times do people put pressure upon people in order to get them to conform to what they want them to say? It happens a lot, it happens all the time, and so they state things that is not even true. But give glory to God. You know, I want you to tell the truth. We know this man is a sinner. And this is amazing to me, this man's answer. He said to them, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But one thing I do know, that when I was blind, now I see. You know, I want to encourage us, every one of us, when we come to Christ, we are put immediately into a position of witness. We become a witness of who he is. We become a witness of what he has done in our lives. We become a witness of the radical change that takes place within our lives. We become a witness. And this is all he had. He didn't know, he couldn't, he said, well, I don't know the Bible, I don't know the Old Testament, I don't know a lot of things. Maybe he knew a lot of things, but we often think that we have no influence in our life as we come to Christ because we don't know anything. No, don't worry about that. Tell what God has done. Remember the demoniac, when he wanted to go with Jesus, and Jesus delivered him out of all the demonic possession that he was involved in. And he said, well, I want to go with you, Jesus. And Jesus says, no. You go back and tell the place that you grew up with, that all of those people back there that have seen the radical change in your life, you tell them what God has done in your life. And so the next time that Jesus visits that place, he finds out that that man was faithful in his testimony, and multitudes of people came to him for healing, for deliverance, for whatever they had in their life because of the man's testimony. Our witness tells in our countenance, our witness tells in the peace that we have, in our joy level, it tells in our character, it tells, and when people see a radical change, they see a radical change in our life. And so we are a witness. And this is what he says. One thing I know, that though I was blind, I now see. And then they said to him again, then, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And I love this answer that he gave to them. He says, I told you already. You didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciple? What a testimony. What a witness. And I can imagine what he felt like at that time. I thought, well, so then what did they do? They reviled him. And they said, you are his disciples, but we are Moses' disciples. In other words, what they're saying is we are following the law. We are Moses' disciples. We are the followers of the law. We stay strictly to the law. We abide by the law. We observe the law. We perform in the law. And this is Pharisees who did this purposely, always trying to live perfection so that they were acceptable to God. And of course that conflicted with God's message of salvation because they thought they could earn it in their own righteousness. And Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never make it into heaven. Very important. So we know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he even came from. Isn't that an amazing focus that they have here? And the man answered and said to them, Why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. Isn't this amazing? He understood that God, evil people don't come out and do wonderful, godly miracles. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. He's already given a testimony of the reality within his life. So since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. And what he's saying is Moses didn't open the eyes of anybody. The prophets didn't open the eyes of anybody. This man, Jesus, opened my eyes. And it ought to be proof, the very proof that he is of God. You don't need any more proof than that. This is what he was laying out to these church leaders, the religious leaders. And so if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. What a testimony. The evidence is there, and they couldn't refute it. And as they try to refute it, they are found out that they are speaking out of their heads and not their hearts. They have not had a heart change. They're speaking out of what they want to believe, the law, want to think that somehow their righteousness, their good works of keeping the law, which they're never kept it perfectly, as Jesus pointed out, because the law is spiritual. It's not just a physical act that we try to perform, but the law is spiritual. And so Jesus pointed all that out in the Sermon on the Mount. And so if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And so they did what they did, and they answered and said, You are completely born in sins, and you are teaching us, and they cast him out. This is, we often hear the thing, don't judge, and Christians shouldn't judge. This is the wrong kind of judgment. This is the kind of judging that God is talking about, putting a final judgment upon a person like this. They're copping out. They're taking the easy way out. They've got a problem. They've got a dilemma. They've got division. They've got all kinds of problems involved with their issues of trying to explain away why this guy got healed, got his eyes opened. And they can't explain it away because they're refusing to acknowledge the reality that Jesus is who he was. And they had already tried to stone him when he made the claim of who he was. And that was the day before. And now here they are, stuck in a dilemma, trying to explain away who he is. And so what do? They have to do what all the political leaders do anymore. They start yelling and screaming and try to deface the reputation of the person that they're coming against, instead of getting down to the basic facts and speaking some truth. And so here they are, they're judging. They're judging. And this is the kind of a judgment that God says, do not even think about that. We are to be discerning type of people. And so they cast him out. They excommunicate him. A cowardly way out of a problem. Now Jesus heard, and this is what is so important. This is the beauty of this whole thing. Because Jesus is now going to fulfill the purpose of the healing of the blind man. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And his answer, he says, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Wow. Can you imagine? Unbelievable truth coming in. You know, it's kind of like when God brings us into that reality that we're a sinner. We need desperately to have salvation. We need desperately to commit our life to Christ and receive his mercy and his grace and his forgiveness. There's something that comes in, and this guy, he says, you've both seen him, and he's talking with you right now, that conviction. And he cries out and he says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The result of true believing isn't the focus upon yourself, isn't the focus upon your temporal goods, isn't the focus upon your gifts and your abilities. It's a focus upon Jesus Christ, what he did for you, redemption. And I'm redeemed. How I love to proclaim it. I'm redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. It's his infinite mercies, and now I'm his child, that I've received that infinite mercy of God. What a tremendous thing when we are totally turned around and you just cry out, Lord, I believe. And the works that God came to fulfill were being fulfilled. See, the Lord wanted to heal man. That was his purpose. But it went beyond the healing. It went to the point of salvation for that man. And that man's salvation, we can know that it affected so many people. In fact, even before his salvation, just the healing alone affected these people and put them in a tremendous dilemma of who is this guy? Is he Christ? No, we're rejecting him. We don't believe he's Christ. No, we can't accept the testimony. No, we can see the evidence. It must be satanic, Satan that did that kind of... No, it's not. Satan, again, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. He didn't come to do good. He doesn't come to heal. He doesn't come to do anything except to put you into bondage. And if he does produce a healing, which there are certain situations that can happen, to where if he puts something on a person, he can take that thing off of a person. But that is not going to bring him glory. And he's not in the focus of trying to bless people. He's in the focus of destroying, stealing, killing, doing whatever he can to bring and render people into a position where they will not accept God, and their ministry, if they are a Christian, is dubbed down to an ineffective ministry. That's why it's so serious that we be fully committed to the Lord, fully surrendered, loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, motivated by the love of Christ, and then it affects the ministry that God has for us to be involved in. And so he yells, yes, I believe. And the Lord said, for judgment I come into this world, that those who do not see, and that may see, and that those who do see may be made blind. Some of the Pharisees heard this. And they were with him when they heard these words, and they said to him, are we blind also? And he just got done saying, he said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. In other words, he said, you've seen this miracle that I just produced. You've seen the radical change of this healing within this blind man. You've seen it all. And yet you say he was a sinner, And so it must be the result of his sin or the sin of his parents or whoever. And obviously, the one that did the healing, because he did it on the Sabbath day, because he violated the law from their perspective of not being able to tolerate the reality of the spirit of the law, they said, you are condemned. You were blind. If you were blind, you would now have no sin. But because you say, we see, in other words, they said, we know, they put this improper, radical judgment upon this man. They put their radical judgment upon Jesus, saying he was a demonic, from the demon influence. And so all of this, they said, is what we did. And he says, because of this, because of your unwillingness to see the reality of what Christ did, what I did, and acknowledge the reality of that, he says, you're going to remain in your sin remains. And judgment. That's why he says, for judgment I come into this world. He is the judge. We're not the judge. God is the judge. And we need to make sure that we are where we belong with him and not turning around and trying to put a judgment, an incorrect judgment upon people just as they did to this man and upon Jesus himself. You know, I want to encourage us as we consider the ways of God, that we would consider who our God is. And he is not like us. He is supernatural. And it's exciting because even as Isaiah 40:31 says, they that wait and are intermingled with the Lord in an intimacy of relationship will renew their strength. That word renew means they will exchange strength. In other words, he's not just saying, hey, I'm going to add a little bit of my strength to your strength and then you'll be a stronger person. No, he says, I'm going to reduce you, your strength, your abilities, all these other things that you think are so wonderful. He says, I'm going to reduce you out of those things to where I'm going to put my strength within you. And then you're going to find out that you can run and not be weary. You're going to walk and not faint. And you're going to be able to begin to do and be involved in my works. God has a heart for people. He has a heart for every single one of us here. Just like he had a purpose in that blind man's life, just like he had a purpose in Fanny Crosby's life, just like he has a purpose in every one of our lives. He knows exactly the path that he has laid out for us to walk in, and he continues to work in us to will and to do, to walk willingly. Sometimes I think we kick a little bit, but he continues to work in us to walk in a position of faith and love and obedience before him. So I want to encourage us, don't get weary in well-doing. Don't worry about what is going to happen because of your righteous standard as you maybe give a witness for the Lord and offend somebody. You know, just recognize God is with you as you go through the circumstances of life. If things happen that we don't want to happen to us, and we're all getting older, we might as well face the truth. We're not getting any younger. And we see the deterioration within that flesh. But that's not our focus. Our focus is, what can I do? My time is limited. What can I do now to be, as a servant of Jesus Christ, to do the works of God? What has he called you to do? Today. We leave here today, and we need to recognize today is a limitation of time. We may get tomorrow. We may not get tomorrow. We may get a week. We may get a month. We may get a year. We don't know how long we're going to get, but we do know that we are to be busy about our Father's business. Let's be totally intertwined, waiting upon God, intertwined with God, to the point that we are being totally turned around, metamorphosized, supernaturally changed into the very character and image of God, with his heart, with his desires, with his love, with his mercy, with his forgiveness, with his purposes being fulfilled in us and through us.